Well, welcome to the Catholic Reason, a radio production of St. Michael Catholic Radio based here in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, where we think through various claims made by the Catholic Church concerning issues of faith, morality, and sometimes culture, and provide reasons behind those claims. I'm Dr. Karlo Broussard, staff apologist and speaker for Catholic Answers, and a member of the Chancery Evangelization team here at the Diocese of Tulsa and Eastern Oklahoma. The Catholic Reason airs locally here in Tulsa every Thursday from 4 to 5 p.m. on St. Michael Catholic Radio, 94.9 and 102.9. But you may be listening on your own local Catholic radio station at a different time, since the Catholic Reason is aired on other Catholic stations throughout the country. So wherever you're listening in from, a very special welcome to you, as always, and thanks for joining me. Remember, you can download the show through whichever podcast platform you use by subscribing to the Eastern Oklahoma Catholic Podcast. You can also access the archived episodes at karlobroussard.com under both the audio and video tab. So far here on the Catholic Reason, when we've talked about the words of the Last Supper, "This is my body, this is my blood," we've only looked at Protestant comebacks to the literal interpretation of those words. But we've never spent time making a positive case for such an interpretation. That's to say, we've never given reasons why we think Jesus intended to literally change bread and wine into his body and blood. It's one thing to knock down arguments against your view, but it's another to make a case for it. So that's what I'm going to do in today's episode of The Catholic Reason. The case I'm going to make is this. There are certain typological precursors to the Last Supper that I'll argue give reason to interpret Jesus' words with a realistic understanding. The first typological precursor is something we spoke about in a previous episode, namely the manna in the wilderness. We appealed to this for a related but slightly different purpose. So I'd like to go over it again for our purposes here as we focus on the words of the Last Supper. If you recall in John 6, Jesus explicitly draws a parallel between the Eucharist and the owed manna. Here's what he says in John 6, starting in verse 49, "Your fathers ate the manna in the wilderness, and they died. This is the bread which comes down from heaven, that a man may eat of it and not die. I am the living bread which came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. And the bread which I shall give for the life of the world is my flesh." And the implication there is that we will eat this bread, which is his flesh. Now, this quote-unquote bread that Jesus says is his flesh is given to the apostles for them to eat at the Last Supper. Thus, Jesus intentionally reveals that the owed manna is an interpretive context for what Jesus gives the apostles to eat at the Last Supper, namely the Eucharist. So let's think a little bit about the owed manna. Consider this question. Was the owed manna ordinary bread, or was it miraculous? Well, the answer is it was miraculous. Consider, for example, in Exodus chapter 16, verse 13, it appeared every day when the morning dew would burn off. It never lasted more than a day, except on the Sabbath. When the Israelites didn't obey the instruction to leave none until the next day, we're told in verses 19 through 20 of Exodus 16 that it bred worms and became foul. That's a little bit out the ordinary. But when the Israelites held it over in accordance with the Lord's command, that is, to assure that they didn't work on the Sabbath, carrying over some to the Sabbath, it didn't breed worms and become foul, according to verses 22 through 26 of Exodus 16. It appeared every day for 40 years and stopped only upon the Israelites entering the Promised Land, according to Exodus 16:35 and Joshua 5:10 through 12. You read those in collaboration together. A jar with an omer's worth was kept in the Israelite sanctuary, as we're told in Exodus 16:31 through 34, throughout the generations. So for the manna to continue to exist, a physical substance, continuing to exist throughout many generations is a miracle in and of itself. So this old manna was indeed miraculous, had miraculous qualities associated with it. It was not mere ordinary bread. Okay, now with this background knowledge, let's now consider what follows from the belief that the Eucharist is merely a symbol of Jesus' body and blood. That's going to be our target. We want to target this idea that the Eucharist is merely a symbol of Jesus' body and blood. And then with this background knowledge of the old manna and how the Eucharist is paralleling the old manna, we can see what follows. The following line of reasoning is taken from Dr. Brant Petrie's book, Jesus and the Jewish Roots of the Eucharist. You can check it out. It's a fantastic book. But this line of reasoning is coming from Dr. Petrie. I didn't make this up. Consider that if the Eucharist were merely symbolic, then it wouldn't have any miraculous aspect to it. That's pretty obvious. It would just be a symbol of Jesus' body and blood. Nothing miraculous about that. And if that's the case, well then we would have the new manna, which is the Eucharist, being inferior to the old manna, since the old manna was miraculous. But I ask you, can the new manna be inferior or less miraculous than the old manna? Of course not. That's a no-go in biblical theology. The New Testament fulfillment is always greater than the Old Testament type. Thus, we must conclude that the Eucharist is not merely a symbol of Jesus' body and blood. So here's a summary of the argument in logical form. Premise 1, if the Eucharist were merely a symbol, then the new manna would be inferior to the old. Premise 2, but the new manna cannot be inferior to the old manna, and so therefore our conclusion, the Eucharist is not merely a symbol. Okay, let's now move to our second typological precursor, the ratification ceremony of the Sinaitic covenant in Exodus chapter 24, verses 3 through 8. So notice so far we've looked at one typological precursor, the manna in the wilderness. Seeing that the manna was miraculous, that leads us to the conclusion that the Eucharist as the new manna cannot be merely a symbol, lest we have to say that the new manna is inferior to the old. So it just makes sense that the new manna would be at least miraculous like the old manna. As to how it is miraculous, well, the answer is given to us by our Lord when he says, "This is my body, this is my blood." That would provide for us a miraculous aspect to the new manna, that bread and wine actually becomes Jesus' body and blood, and thereby making it superior to the old manna. Not only is the new manna miraculous, insofar as bread and wine is changed into something else, but it's superior insofar as it's Jesus' own body and blood. Okay, now, again, moving to our second typological precursor, that is the ratification ceremony of the Sinaitic covenant, recorded in Exodus chapter 24, verses 3 through 8. Now, less is known about this precursor, so I'm going to start there. Here's what we read in Exodus chapter 24, verses 3 through 8, which I'm going to argue that this is the interpretive context for understanding what Jesus is doing at the Last Supper. Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord and all the ordinances. And all the people answered with one voice and said, "All the words which the Lord has spoken we will do." And Moses wrote all the words of the Lord, and he rose early in the morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain, and 12 pillars according to the 12 tribes of Israel. And he sent young men of the people of Israel who offered burnt offerings and sacrificed peace offerings of oxen to the Lord. And Moses took half of the blood and put it in basins, and half of the blood he threw against the altar. Verse 7, then he took the book of the covenant and read in the hearing of the people, and they said, "All that the Lord has spoken, we will do, and we will be obedient." And here's verse 8. This is the key verse. And Moses took the blood and threw it upon the people and said, Behold the blood of the covenant, which the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words. So that phrase there, blood of covenant, is going to be key. And then, of course, the whole ceremonial context of what's happening with this ratification of the Sinaitic covenant. Now, with that in hand, let's go to the institution narrative as given to us by Matthew. Matthew records this in chapter 26, verse 27. And Jesus took a chalice, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to the apostles, saying, "Drink of it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." Notice, Jesus uses the phrase blood of the covenant in reference to what he's doing at the Last Supper. This is a clear indication that Jesus directly intends to draw a parallel between what Moses did on Sinai, as recorded in Exodus 24, and what he's doing at the Last Supper. And such a parallel leads to the conclusion that the Last Supper, in Jesus' mind, is the ratification ceremony of the new covenant. Now, I'm going to suggest and argue on the other side of the break that with this parallel in hand or in mind, we can conclude that Jesus intends the contents of the chalice to be his real blood, the blood of the new covenant. But I'm going to have to argue for that on the other side of the break because I'm coming up on a break. So my friends, I'm Dr. Karlo Broussard. You're listening to The Catholic Reason. Don't go anywhere. Well, welcome back, my friends, to The Catholic Reason. In today's episode, we're making a positive case for the literal interpretation of Jesus' words, "This is my body, this is my blood," at the Last Supper. In previous episodes, we've looked at Protestant objections or comebacks, responses to the literal interpretation. But today's episode, we're just looking at reasons why we think, reasons why we can reasonably conclude that Jesus intended his words to be taken literally. And the general overall strategy for coming to that conclusion is looking at typological precursors to what Jesus is doing at the Last Supper, which I'm arguing gives us reason to conclude with a literal interpretation of Jesus' words. And the first typological precursor that we looked at was the old manna, the manna in the wilderness. Given that the Eucharist is the new manna, we can reasonably conclude that the Eucharist cannot be merely a symbol, lest it be inferior to the old manna, since the Eucharist being merely a symbol would make it non-miraculous, whereas the old manna was miraculous. And then before our break, we started looking at a second typological precursor, and that is the ratification ceremony of the Sinaitic covenant as recorded in Exodus chapter 24. And we pointed out how the key phrase there was what Moses said, the blood of the covenant. Now, when we come back to the institution narrative, according to Matthew's record of the words of institution at the Last Supper, Jesus tells the apostles to drink the cup, and he pronounces, "For this is my blood of the covenant." So Jesus uses the phrase blood of the covenant in reference to what he's doing at the Last Supper, and this shows us that Jesus directly intends to draw a parallel between what he's doing at the Last Supper and what Moses did on Sinai. And such a parallel leads to the conclusion, so I will argue, I think so far it's immediate, that this parallel leads us to the conclusion that the Last Supper is the ratification ceremony of the new covenant. That's what we can establish so far. Now, here's where we left off before our last break. With this background knowledge, let's now consider what would follow from the Eucharist being merely a symbol of Jesus' blood. Given this knowledge that the Last Supper is the ratification ceremony of the new covenant, in light of the interpretive context of the ratification ceremony of the Sinaitic covenant, what would follow from the Eucharist being merely a symbol, from that supposition? Well, consider this. If the Eucharist were merely a symbol of Jesus' blood, when then Jesus would be using something less sacred than blood, mere wine, to ratify something more sacred than the old covenant, namely the new covenant. That would make the new covenant less dignified or sacred than the old. To use something less sacred to ratify that which is more sacred, the new covenant, would thereby make the new covenant less sacred than the old covenant. But that can't be. The new covenant is greater than the old, and thus demands at least something as sacred as blood, if not something more. Therefore, we must conclude that the Eucharist is not merely a symbol. So here's a summary of this argument. Premise 1. If the Eucharist were merely a symbol of Jesus' blood, then the ratifying ceremony of the new covenant would be inferior to the ratifying ceremony of the old. Premise 2. But the new covenant ratifying ceremony cannot be inferior to the old, and so therefore our conclusion, the Eucharist cannot be merely a symbol of Jesus' blood. Now, given Jesus' words, the only alternative to the Eucharist being a symbol, merely a symbol of Jesus' blood, is that it's actually his blood. So notice what we did there. If the Eucharist can't be merely a symbol of Jesus' blood, then the only alternative option is that it's actually his blood, especially in light of his words when he says, "This is my blood of the covenant." And since we've shown why the Eucharist can't be merely a symbol of Jesus' blood, it follows that it must be his blood. And it's his blood that makes the new covenant ratifying ceremony more dignified and sacred than the old. All right, now, a Protestant might counter here along the lines of Apologist James White and say that since this is a direct allusion to Exodus 24, the contents of the chalice can't be real blood. Because, as White argues in his book, The Roman Catholic Controversy, on page 176, quote, "The blood of the covenant was blood from a sacrificial victim, not a living person. Had the blood not been shed, it would have been the blood of the covenant." In light of this, White argues that because Christ's blood had not been shed yet on Calvary when he spoke of the substance in the cup at the Last Supper as his blood of the covenant, the contents of the cup, so White is arguing, couldn't have been the blood of the new covenant. For the blood of the new covenant is Christ's blood shed on the cross. Given this premise, White concludes that the contents of the cup, quote, "have to be symbols." He goes on, he infers symbols of Jesus' blood that would be shed the next day. So this is an interesting counter, because what White is doing here is he's turning the tables and saying, no, actually the phrase blood of the covenant is evidence that the contents of the chalice is not Jesus' real blood. Whereas we've been arguing that the phrase blood of the covenant is evidence that it's Jesus' blood. And White's point is that the phrase blood of the covenant refers to Jesus' blood shed. Blood of the covenant can only refer to the blood of the sacrificed victim. And since Jesus had not been sacrificed yet at the Last Supper, it follows, so White concludes, that the contents of the chalice cannot be Jesus' real blood. Now, on the surface, this is a very good counter-argument, and it demands a legitimate response. And so kudos to White for proposing this Protestant comeback here. Now, one response is that the issue of whether real blood is present is different from the issue of whether that blood presently has the status of being blood of the covenant. Consider the victims on Sinai, for example. Before they were slain, their blood didn't have the status of being the blood of the covenant. But that doesn't mean the blood present in the victims wasn't real blood. Now, Christ's blood at the Last Supper could still be present in the chalice, even if it didn't yet have the status of being the blood of the covenant, since he had been slain yet. And that's all the doctrine of transubstantiation requires, the belief that Christ's real and substantial blood was made present in the cup at the Last Supper. Whether his blood is technically the quote-unquote blood of the covenant at that moment doesn't bear on whether the wine became Jesus' blood. We could suppose, for argument's sake, Jesus was simply speaking about the substance in the cup as his real blood that would soon become the blood of the covenant, but it would still be real blood. So I think the problem with White's argument is that he thinks that if not blood of covenant, then not real blood in the substance, in the cup. But that's a non sequitur. That consequent doesn't necessarily follow from the antecedent. Why? Because it still could be true that Jesus' blood is not yet the quote-unquote blood of the covenant, since he would not have been sacrificed, and yet the contents of the chalice still be his real blood. You would have real blood that simply has not taken on the status yet of the blood of the covenant. And so that's one response to White's argument. You can have real blood and it not yet be the blood of the covenant. Now, another way that we can respond is to challenge the assumption that Christ's blood at the Last Supper cannot be described, even at this stage, as blood of the covenant. That's an assumption that White makes. It cannot be described or have the status of blood of the covenant because he had not been sacrificed yet. Now, there are two ways that we can do this to show that even the contents of the chalice as Jesus' blood at the Last Supper could still take on the status of the blood of the covenant. First, if it's true that Jesus' blood is truly present in the cup at the Last Supper, well, then his blood is the very blood that would be used to solemnize the new covenant on the cross. It thus could reasonably be described as blood of the covenant, whether or not the covenant had been solemnized yet, because it is the blood of the covenant. The same would be true of the blood of the offerings Moses uses for the original covenant the day before they were slain, and their blood was used to solemnize it. Like it was their real blood that is the blood of the covenant, would be the blood of the covenant even when they are sacrificed. Now, White might counter and say, well, that just begs the question. Well, here's another way in which we can see how Jesus' blood at the Last Supper would be the blood of the covenant. Notice the objection wrongly assumes, again, like I said before, that the blood can't be the blood of the covenant because Christ's sacrifice hadn't been offered yet on the cross. But here's a question. Why should we believe that Christ's redemptive sacrifice is restricted to just the moment of his death? If we consider what the Bible teaches about sacrifices, there's good reason to think that Jesus' redemptive sacrifice was not restricted to his death, but extended beyond that, before and after. So, for example, death was a key moment in the Old Testament sacrifices, but the sacrifice didn't begin at the moment of death. The sacrificial rituals consisted of many things that preceded death: bringing the animal into the sacred precincts, examining the animals for blemish, placing hands on its head, the confession of sins by both the priest and the penitent. All of these things made up the sacrifice. Now, friends, I'm coming up on my next break, so I'm going to have to hit the pause button there. We'll pick back up with this on the other side. Don't go anywhere. I'm Dr. Karlo Broussard. You're listening to The Catholic Reason. Well, welcome back, my friends, to The Catholic Reason. Before our last break, we were considering a counter-argument from Protestant apologist James White, who says that the contents of the chalice could not have been Jesus' real blood precisely because Jesus had not been slain yet. He had not been sacrificed. And the reason why he argues that is because Jesus says and speaks of the contents of the chalice and uses the phrase, the blood of the covenant. Well, White argues that blood of the covenant can only be applied to the blood of a sacrificed victim. Since Jesus had not been sacrificed yet, he must have been referring to his blood that would be shed on the cross the next day. And therefore, the contents of the chalice cannot be Jesus' real blood, since he calls it the blood of the covenant, but yet he had not been sacrificed yet. So in response to this counter-argument, we already said, first of all, that it's a non sequitur to say that it's not Jesus's blood because it's not the blood of the covenant yet. As I pointed out in our last segment, that you can still have real substantial blood in the contents, as the contents of the chalice, and it not yet have the status of the blood of the covenant. So it's just a non sequitur to say it's not real blood because it's not blood of the covenant. And then secondly, I was pointing out how there are reasons to think, or at least I was beginning to point out, how there are reasons to think that even though Christ had not been slain yet, that his blood could still have the status of blood of the covenant. Because notice White's objection assumes that Christ's blood can't be the blood of the covenant because he had not been offered yet on the cross. But as I was pointing out, why should we believe that Christ's redemptive sacrifice is restricted just to the moment of his death? If we consider what the Bible teaches about sacrifices, there's good reason to think that Jesus' redemptive sacrifice was not restricted to his death. So, for example, death was a key moment in the Old Testament sacrifices, obviously. But those sacrifices didn't begin at the moment of death. The sacrificial rituals consisted of many things that preceded death. So, for example, bringing the animal into the sacred precincts, Exodus 29:42, Leviticus 1:2-3. Examining the animals for blemish, placing hands on its head, according to Leviticus 1:4 and 4:15. The confession of sins by both the priest, Leviticus 16:21, and the penitent, Leviticus 5:5. All of these things made up the single sacrifice. These were all different aspects of one single sacrifice. Moreover, the New Testament teaches us that there's such a thing as a living sacrifice. Paul tells us in Romans 12:1, present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your ritual, spiritual worship. Elsewhere, Paul considers the Gentiles as his offering in his priestly service of the gospel of God there in Romans 15:16. This wide range of what's possible for sacrifices in God's plan of salvation shows that Christ's redemptive sacrifice may not have been restricted to his death, but may have begun while he was still alive. And so that raises the question, well, did it? Did Christ's redemptive sacrifice begin at some point prior to the actual death, such that we could parallel it to the Old Testament sacrifices and seeing how different stages and aspects of a single sacrifice? Well, the Catechism of the Catholic Church answers that question in the affirmative. Check out what it states in paragraph 517. Redemption comes to us above all through the blood of his cross, but this mystery is at work throughout Christ's entire life. Even if an individual doesn't accept such an expansive understanding of Christ's sacrifice throughout his entire life, Protestant theologians also identify Jesus' sacrifice with his passion as a whole. And on this we can agree. His redemptive sacrifice may reasonably include the sufferings that immediately led up to his death and were intentionally directed toward the crucifixion. The obvious example is his agony in the garden, where he requests 3 times that the Father remove the cup of suffering from him, according to Matthew 26:39-46. Was Jesus already suffering at the time? And so the next question would be, was Jesus already suffering at the time of the Last Supper, the relevant time for our purposes? Well, consider that Jesus would have been in distress over Judas's betrayal, which he predicts at the Last Supper, according to Matthew 26:24-25. In John's account, we even get a hint at Jesus' inner suffering when he tells Judas, what you are going to do quickly, as we read there in John 13:27. This suggests that Jesus isn't looking forward to what is to come, and, like most of us, wants to complete his passion as quickly as possible without prolonging it. Now, because this suffering at the Last Supper, and even his suffering before the Last Supper, particularly in the Garden of Gethsemane, is directed to the cross, we can reasonably say it's a part of his redemptive sacrifice. And since Christ's redemptive sacrifice is the new covenant institution sacrifice, we can conclude that the new covenant redemptive sacrifice had already begun at the Last Supper and even prior to it with his agony in the garden. Thus, at the time of the Last Supper, so I argue, Christ's blood already had the status of quote-unquote blood of the covenant. It did not require his death for the blood to become blood of the covenant, because it is blood of the covenant in the very single sacrifice that he's offering, which includes the suffering that he's enduring and the agony and at the Last Supper. So the real and substantial blood of the new covenant sacrificial victim present in the cup and the new covenant redemptive sacrifice is present there, right? The blood that is the blood of the covenant in that single sacrifice, Jesus says, is present in the cup. Yes, the sacrifice will culminate, at least his death on the cross will culminate the next day. But his blood is still blood of the new covenant sacrifice, and thus reasonably can have the status of blood of the covenant. And if, as we said already, if blood of the covenant is present, if blood of the covenant, and in light of the ratification ceremony of the Sinaitic covenant in Exodus 24, then real blood, Jesus' real blood must be present in the cup. So those are two typological precursors, the owed manna and the ratification ceremony of the Sinaitic covenant. Now, our next typological precursor to the Last Supper that I argue gives reason to interpret the words of institution literally is the atoning sacrifices of the Old Testament. At the Last Supper, Jesus doesn't just speak of his blood as the blood of the covenant, but he also speaks of it as being poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. And the present participle is actually used there in Greek. So it has a present tense of his blood being poured out for the forgiveness of sins. Now, this language harkens to the sacrifices for sin in the Old Testament, also known as the atoning sacrifices. Consider a couple of examples. In Exodus 29:12, we read this: "Take part of the blood of the bull and put it upon the horns of the altar with your finger, and the rest of the blood you shall pour out at the base of the altar." Now, again, keep in mind, these are instructions being given for the atoning sacrifices, sacrifices to atone for sin, for the forgiveness of sins. And we have this imagery of pouring the blood out at the base of the altar. Leviticus 4:7, "And the priest shall put some of the blood on the horns of the altar of fragrant incense before the Lord, which is in the tent of meeting. And the rest of the blood of the bull he shall pour out at the base of the altar of burnt offering, which is at the door of the tent of meeting." For Jesus to use such language concerning what he's doing at the Last Supper reveals that he views what he's doing to be an atoning sacrifice as well. And insofar as he views it to be a present atoning sacrifice, that would lend further credence to it having his blood having the status of blood of the covenant, getting back to our previous point. But for our purposes here, now let's go back and take this atoning sacrifice background knowledge and apply it to the Last Supper. Obviously, the atoning sacrifices and the pouring out of blood at the base of the altar is an interpretive context. So now I ask, would a symbol of blood suffice for an atoning sacrifice in the Old Covenant? And of course, the answer is no. And so we can further reason. If a symbol of blood wouldn't have sufficed for atoning sacrifices in the Old Covenant, then surely a symbol of blood would not suffice for this atoning sacrifice in the New Covenant, Jesus' sacrifice, the Last Supper. Insofar as Jesus reveals the Last Supper action to be his atoning sacrifice for the New Covenant, which he says, the blood which is being poured out for the forgiveness of sins, it follows that the contents in the cup cannot be merely a symbol of his blood. So here's a summary of the argument. Premise 1. If the Eucharist were merely a symbol of Jesus' blood, then the Last Supper would not be his atoning sacrifice. Premise 2, but Jesus reveals that the Last Supper is his atoning sacrifice, or at least part of his atoning sacrifice, since he says the cup is presently being poured out, since he says the cup is his blood presently being poured out for the forgiveness of sins. And so therefore, we can conclude the Eucharist is not merely a symbol of Jesus' blood. And like I argued before, if the Eucharist isn't merely a symbol of Jesus' blood, then the only other option is that it is his real blood. All right, so I'm coming up on my last break for today's episode. And on the other side, we're going to pick back up with our last typological precursor, and that is the Passover lamb. Stay tuned. I'm Dr. Karlo Broussard. You're listening to The Catholic Reason. Well, welcome back, my friends, to our last and final segment of today's episode of The Catholic Reason, where we've been making a positive case for the literal interpretation of Jesus' words at the Last Supper. This is my body, this is my blood. And our overall approach is that there are typological precursors of the Last Supper that give us strong reasons to conclude that Jesus intended his words to be taken literally, that he literally made his body present under the appearance of bread and literally made his blood present under the appearance of wine. And the first typological precursors that we looked at in today's episode was the manna and the wilderness, looking at how it was miraculous, a variety of different miraculous effects or aspects of the old manna. And given that background knowledge, and knowing that Jesus intentionally draws a parallel between the Eucharist and the old manna, thereby concluding that the Eucharist is the new manna, it follows that the Eucharist cannot be merely a symbol, lest the new manna, the Eucharist, be inferior to the old, since non-miraculous is indeed inferior to miraculous. The second typological precursor we looked at was the ratification ceremony of the Sinaitic covenant in Exodus chapter 24, where Moses pronounces that blood to be the blood of the covenant. Jesus pronounces the contents of his chalice to be the blood of the new and everlasting covenant. To quote from Luke, Matthew leaves out everlasting, just says the blood of the covenant. So Jesus intentionally is drawing a parallel between what he's doing at the Last Supper and the ratification ceremony of the Sinaitic covenant of old. And that provides for us a good reason to conclude that the contents of the chalice must be his real blood, lest we have something less sacred, merely wine, being used to ratify that which is more sacred, namely the new covenant. And that's a no-go. So if the Eucharist is merely a symbol, it would make the Last Supper as the ratification ceremony of the new covenant inferior to the old. But that can't be. And then thirdly, before our last break, we looked at the typological precursor of the atoning sacrifices of the Old Testament, where the blood of the sacrificial victim was, quote unquote, poured out at the base of the altar. And Jesus uses that very same language to speak of the contents of the chalice at the Last Supper. He says, this is the blood of the covenant, which shall be poured out for the forgiveness of sins, revealing to us that he sees the Last Supper as at least part of his atoning sacrifice for the new covenant. And if it is his atoning sacrifice for the new covenant, then real and substantial blood must be used, lest the atoning sacrifice of the new covenant be inferior to that of the old, given that blood was sacred within the Jewish theological milieu. Now, I mentioned before our last break that when we came back, we were going to look at our last and final typological precursor, and that is the ritual act of eating the Passover lamb. It's abundantly clear that Jesus intends the Last Supper to be the new Passover, assuming that we agree that the Last Supper was their Passover meal. If you're doubting that, whether the Last Supper was an actual Passover meal for Jesus and his apostles, I would recommend you check out Dr. Brant Petre's book, The Jewish Roots of the Eucharist. There in chapter 3, Petre makes a persuasive case for why the Last Supper was indeed the Passover meal. There are some people who dispute that. So assuming that we agree that the Last Supper was the Passover meal, Jesus is thereby clearly revealing the Last Supper to be the new Passover. Now, what are the clues for Jesus revealing the Last Supper to be the new Passover? Well, first, Jesus viewed his death as his own exodus. In Luke 9:31, Luke tells us that Jesus, quote unquote, appeared in glory. And with Moses and Elijah, Luke tells us he spoke of his departure. Now, as many scholars have pointed out, the Greek word for departure there is exodus. The Last Supper meal is the meal before this new exodus that Jesus was speaking to Moses and Elijah about, namely his departure from this world. Second, Jesus leads the ritual ceremony, even though he's not a father to the apostles. This is unique, given that such a role belonged to the father of the family. Yet another clue that the Last Supper as a Passover meal is the new Passover. Third, the focus of the Last Supper is the new covenant and not the covenant with Abraham. Dr. Petrie explains, again in his book, Jewish Roots of the Eucharist, the focus was on God's covenant with Abraham, talking about the old Passover, the exodus from Egypt, and the entry into the promised land of Canaan. Yet Jesus spoke instead of the quote-unquote new covenant, prophesied by Jeremiah to be fulfilled in the age of salvation, citing 1 Corinthians 11:25 and Jeremiah 31:31 through 33. So that Jesus focuses on the new covenant is a clue that the Last Supper is the new Passover. The fourth point to make is that Jesus shifts the focus from the flesh and blood of the Lamb to his flesh or body and his blood. Again, Petrie writes this, perhaps the most significant. At an ordinary Jewish Passover, the entire liturgy revolved around the body and blood of the sacrificial Passover lamb. He goes on, first the lamb would be slaughtered, and the priests in the temple would pour out the blood of the lamb on the altar. Then the Jews would bring the body of the lamb from the temple to the Passover meal, and the Father would explain its meaning at the meal. Yet at the Last Supper, Jesus did something entirely different. Petrie goes on with his words of explanation. He shifted the focus away from the body and blood of the Passover lamb, of which there is no mention, and turned it toward his own body and blood. He goes on, when we compare Jesus' actions to these ancient Jewish traditions, it doesn't take much imagination to figure out his point. By means of his words over the bread and wine of the Last Supper, Jesus is saying in no uncertain terms, I am the new Passover lamb of the new Exodus. This is the Passover of the Messiah, and I am the new sacrifice. So that's what Petrie writes in his book, Jewish Roots of the Eucharist. It's a pretty persuasive argument. So based on this evidence, we can conclude with a strong degree of certainty that Jesus intended the Last Supper to be the new Passover meal. So like in our previous typological precursors, we had to provide evidence that Jesus intended a certain typological precursor to be the interpretive context of what he's doing. The old manna, the ratification ceremony at the Sinaitic covenant, the atoning sacrifices, and now clearly the old Passover meal. That's another interpretive context for what he's doing at the Last Supper. Now the question becomes, what's the implication? What does this interpretive context teach us? If the Last Supper is the new Passover, what follows? Well, I submit that what follows is the real presence of Christ's flesh in the Eucharist. Again, Brant Petrie makes the argument this way. I can't improve on what he wrote, so I'm just going to quote Dr. Petrie here, rather than try and reinvent the wheel and improve on what he did. In the Old Testament, he writes, was it ever enough simply to sacrifice the lamb? No. Did the actual flesh of the lamb have to be eaten in order for the sacrifice to be complete? Yes. Could a symbol of the lamb's flesh suffice? He goes on, he answers that rhetorical question. By now we know that the answer is negative. In other words, Jesus knew full well what any first century Jew would have known. When it came to the Passover, you not only have to kill the lamb in order to fulfill God's law, in order to be saved from death, you had to eat the lamb. As with the old Passover of the first Exodus, so with the new Passover of the Messiah. The main difference between the two is that in the new Passover, the lamb is a person, and the blood of redemption is the blood of the Messiah. Again, that's on page 75 of his book, The Jewish Roots of the Eucharist, Unlocking the Secrets of the Last Supper. So there we have the argument from the Eucharist being the new Passover. We have the Last Supper being the new Passover meal, which is being celebrated in light of the new Exodus that Jesus is leading, departing from this world into a new existence, a new life, which of course points to our new Exodus of departing from this world at the end of time into a new life of a new heaven and a new earth, the promised land of heaven and earth. And the Last Supper is that Passover meal, which Jesus is giving to us to remember in perpetuity for all generations. Given that the Last Supper is the new Passover, it follows that the Eucharist must be the real flesh of Jesus, the Lamb. It is unthinkable. I'll retract that language. I would argue it's unreasonable to think that the Eucharist, the new Passover ceremony, would involve something that's not flesh, that it would involve merely a symbol of the flesh of the Lamb. Given that it's the new Passover, and in order for it to be superior to the old, not only must real flesh be present there that the participants partake of, but that it be the flesh of the true and new Lamb, Jesus Christ. So, my friends, my claim today is that the typological precursors of the Last Supper give us reason to conclude that Jesus made his body and blood present under the appearances of bread and wine. Those precursors were the manna, the ratification ceremony on Sinai in Exodus 24, the atoning sacrifices of the Old Testament, and of course, the Old Passover. All of these four typological precursors, again, serve as an interpretive context for what Jesus is giving us at the Last Supper. And what we learn from those interpretive contexts is that what he gives us at the Last Supper cannot be merely symbols of his body and blood, but must indeed be his body and blood. My friends, thanks for listening today. The Catholic Reason is a production of St. Michael Catholic Radio based here in Broken Arrow. Remember, you can download the show through whichever podcast platform you use by subscribing to the Eastern Oklahoma Catholic Podcast. You can check out the episodes as well as my website, KarloBroussard.com. I invite you to join me again next week. Tell a friend. I'll talk to you then. God bless.